The film begins in space with the Avalon spacecraft on autopilot heading for the colony planet Homestead 2 during a mass exodus of Earth's population. The crew and 5,000 passengers are all in hibernation capsules for the 120-year voyage. The trip is now 30 years ago. The ship goes through a meteor storm and energy is diverted to the front shields. Then the ship collides with a large meteor and energy flashes. Red alert screens flash in the control panel, then quickly returns to normal. Something bad happened. Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, wakes up in his pod to a cheerful computer voice telling him that they'll be arriving at Homestead 2 soon. He is told that it is normal to feel confused and weak after hibernating. The bracelet on his arm is scanned and the computer guides him to his cabin where he sleeps. He wakes up the next day, wondering what to wear when he encounters other passengers, then heads to a cafeteria where he is the only one. He attends an orientation session on settler life in Homestead, but he is the only one there. The cheerful computer-generated instructor doesn't understand her question of why no one else is there. Jim goes to the main lobby and gets no help from the information booth. He finds an office where he can send a message to the Homestead Company warning it's going to be expensive. He sends a message that he is the only one awake and needs help, then learns that it will be 15 years before anyone on Earth receives his message. He is alone. Jim finds manuals for all the ship's equipment. He studies how to use the hibernation modules, but finds no way to restart them once the person wakes up. He must not enter the area where the crew pods are located to wake someone up and call for help, and he cannot enter the command zone. His bracelet doesn't give him the proper clearance. Jim finds an android bartender named Arthur to talk to, but the android is programmed to give the bartender advice like, if you don't like where you are, change things. Jim is a general class passenger with a basic cabin and breaks into a suite with better amenities. He spends a year with Jim using the ship's entertainment facilities, but with no other people, he becomes more desperately lonely. He goes to an area where passengers can don a spacesuit and exit while safely tethered to the ship. Jim contemplates suicide by opening the airlock without a spacesuit, but stops and runs to the capsule area. He comes across a pod with a beautiful woman inside, Aurora Lane. He studies her passenger profile, which she recorded before the ship set sail. She is a journalist and travels to Homestead to have an adventure and find out why people choose to become a colonist. He reads their stories and finds them perfect. He wrestles with himself about waking her up, knowing that doing so will cause her to die on the ship, but he can't bear the isolation after a year alone, so he has her pod wake her up manually and hides before she can see him. Aurora wakes up alone the next day and goes to the Great Hall where she meets Jim. He tells her the truth about how long he's been up, but doesn't tell her that he woke her up. He asked Arthur, the android bartender, not to tell Aurora what he did, and Arthur agrees. Aurora and Jim talk daily and discuss what can be tried to fix the pods. Aurora swims, runs, and begins to write her story. She asks why Jim left planet Earth, and he says he likes making and fixing things, and on Earth, things are replaced when they break and aren't fixed. He wants to live in a house that he builds himself. His plan was to go to the colony, spend a year there talking to the colonists about why they had left Earth, and then return to Earth. Aurora is a gold-class passenger and she uses her status to purchase more elaborate breakfast meals than her standard clearance entitles him to. After knowing each other for a while, Jim asks Aurora out and she accepts. After eating, he takes her to the spacesuit room where there are 2 suits and they both get dressed and go out. When Aurora comes back inside, they are happy, exercise regularly, watch the stars, and enjoy the ship's entertainment and dining options. Another year goes by, it's Aurora's birthday, and Jim has a special surprise in store for her, a ring that he made. As she walks into the bar, Aurora tells Arthur that she and Jim have no secrets, and Jim agrees, unaware that Arthur interprets this as Jim telling Aurora that he woke her up. Jim enters the men's room and Arthur tells Aurora what a good choice Jim made in choosing her to wake up. Aurora is devastated and furious and she tells Jim to stay away from her. One night she enters her hut while he is sleeping and attacks him with her fists. As she runs, Jim uses a ship's intercom to explain himself, but Aurora screams that Jim took her life. As all of this happens, the control room receives more and more reports of system failures over time. 2 years have passed since the meteor collision. One day Gus Mancuso wakes up and appears in the hall. He's chief of the deck crew and got up early. Hibernation pods have never failed before, and he explains that something big is wrong. His bracelet takes them to the command center, where they find that the ship's automatic diagnostics have failed and they must manually check each deck. As Gus runs the tests before this can be done, there is a major gravitational disturbance and Aurora nearly drowns in the pool. Gus discovers that there have been successive outages, and the computer is able to create a timeline showing that the first outage happened 2 years earlier. Gus determines that the first few outages caused power diversions to try to rebalance the load, but the load got too heavy, causing more and more outages. The first affected area was in the main engine area, but they will need to do a manual inspection to determine where. At this point, Gus collapses and Jim and Aurora take him to the infirmary and place him in the self-diagnostic medical scanner. There are multiple necroses throughout his body and death is imminent due to a malfunctioning hibernation pod. He dons his uniform and prepares to die, giving Jim and Aurora his bracelets so they can access the parts of the ship they need to make things right. In engineering, Jim and Aurora find a hole made by a meteorite that passes through some critical areas. She blocks it with a tablet that Jim pushes him, and Jim uses a liquid seal to more seal the hole. The area put under pressure, and you then learn that the exhaust of the merger engine must be ventilated manually. Manual overcoming does not work. Jim must enter a space game and go out to repair it. In the end, he must enter the exhaust to open a component, but it does not remain open, unless Jim keeps it open so that manual ventilation works. Now Aurora is desperate not to lose Jim, argues with him on the radio, but she pulls the lever. Jim is pushed out, his chain breaks and his suit has a hole. He says goodbye to Aurora. She runs to get into a space suit herself and goes to find him. She retrieves Jim by grabbing his chain, but when they come in, he doesn't respond. She drags him to the infirmary and the autodoc says Jim is dead. Aurora uses Gus' bracelet and its override code to get the machine to revive Jim, and it works. He is alive and she is relieved and overjoyed. Afterwards, everything returns to normal on the ship. Working on the autodoctor, Jim tells Aurora that he found that using the command override he could have hibernated her back to the infirmary, but he would be alone again. Aurora realizes that she will never see Jim again and she decides to stay awake with him and build a life on the ship with him. He hands her the makeshift engagement ring he made earlier and she accepts it. 88 years later. It's the end of the voyage, and when the captain and crew wake up and enter the Great Hall, they find a huge tree there, lots of vines and plants, flying birds, and a cabin where Jim and Aurora's grandchildren can live. Aurora's voiceover reads her story to the passengers, explaining how they lived the good life where they were.